Hello and welcome to this Green Recovery Festival session. Today we have our spotlight talk with Sharan Burrow, who is General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. For those who don't know us, the crowd, we are a network for business leaders to explore and exchange ideas on corporate sustainability and responsible business issues. We are hosting the Green Recovery Festival for the next couple of weeks, and the festival is our fortnight of talks, panels and interactive sessions around how the COVID-19 recovery can be aligned with the transition to a low carbon future. We're delighted to be hosting this festival with such a wide range of topics and experts across this week and next week. So I'm going to pass you over to our chair, who is Professor David Grayson. David has chaired or served on various charity, social enterprise and public sector boards. And he is currently chairing the international charity, the Institute of Business Ethics. So there we go. That's enough from me, I think. I'll hand over to you, David. Thank you.
Tiffany, thank you very much. And can I just begin by congratulating the crowd for this two-week festival. I think it's a super contribution to the debates around how do we bounce back better and how do we build back better. Delighted to chair this session this morning with Sharan. Sharan comes originally from New South Wales, a teacher by background. She has had kind of the labour movement, trade unionism in her bloodstream because her family were very involved. She, as you will have seen on the bios, has been a major figure both in the trade union movement in her native Australia and now internationally. And we're going to be hearing from Sharan, I hope, a bit more about the way in which the recovery needs to be both an environmental recovery, but we must not also forget the crucial challenges of hyper-global inequalities alongside the climate emergency and shifting to the low carbon economy. We have at least one thing in common, which is that we both wish that we were able to be in the wonderful Australian sunshine as we go into our European winter, but it doesn't look like we're going to be able to do so. Sharan, welcome, and look forward to hearing what you have to say this morning.
Thank you very much, and I'm very delighted to be with you. Thank you for hosting such a rich and important discussion, because we need a new economic model. It's that simple. And business leaders committed to human rights and the environment in tandem, climate and employment proofing our future, them working together to shift the business model is critical for a very different future. And responsible business conduct is simply non-negotiable. Because you said it, we have a convergence of crisis. Before COVID-19, we actually had a world where inequalities were at historic levels of deprivation for many people, causing deprivation for many people. And that was driving an age of anger. Income inequality was extreme. And when you know that, the social contract began to break down in the 80s. And despite the world being 3 or 4 times richer in those decades, the labour income share was indeed like a roller coaster. And 75% of the world's people still have little or no social protection. So despair was driving this age of anger, and we saw people on the streets in every continent. But then, of course, in addition to that, we have exclusion. That's inequality as well, race, gender, and you've seen people demanding justice in terms of a more diverse world. But equally, we have the climate emergency. And people fail to understand that this is actually not about the planet. The planet will be okay. When human beings are extinct and we're no longer able to run the business models that we've relied on, then in fact, the planet will run clean. The waters will be clean, the trees will grow. And so we've been given this precious home, which is unlike anything else in the universe we've discovered to date. And yet it's our business models, it's human intervention that has created this climate emergency. So we need to deal with what is potentially an extinction crisis, and we have no time. By 2030, we have to stabilize the planet and get to well over half of that commitment to a net zero future. And by 2050, of course, that's the target for 1.5 degrees maintenance. So we're not even in a world where we can maintain what we have today. So extreme weather events are, unfortunately, with the loss of lives and livelihoods, going to become more and more part of our future. This was before COVID-19. And of course, you've seen the breakdown in the environmental boundaries that is actually creating the transmission of these viruses. And so this pandemic is disastrous. It's a health crisis of proportions we've not seen in our lifetimes before. But indeed, it won't be the end unless we can start to put some security back in place. So with COVID-19, we've seen these fractures become craters, because not only have we seen a health crisis that has exposed, in fact, the underfunding of health, the lack of commitment to frontline workers on whom we rely, amongst the lowest paid in the world, understaffed. There are millions and millions of jobs that we could create in health and in care that have been actually neglected, and we can't do that again. And I'll come back to how we fund that. But we need to deal with health. And you know, I'm pleased to see that the majority of people have understood that despite their own deprivation, that health and life are entwined. And it's the greatest act of human solidarity that we've accepted restrictions on our personal freedoms, on our rights, you know, in order to save lives. But that convergence of crisis has resulted now with COVID-19 in a loss of some 500 million jobs in the formal economy, and deprivation or risk of destitution for 1.6 billion people in the informal economy. Why do I say that? Because the breakdown in the social contract has meant that 60% of our workers on this planet are informal. They're informal. They have no rights, no social protection, no rule of law, and they live day by day. So no income on any one day. Then in fact, what we see is, of course, the very risk of survival being lost. And so when you look at the breakdown in the labour market, because governments have failed to regulate the labour market, and a lot of that has been because of the pressure of the economic model that we've had. And then you think about the fact that of those people who are facing destitution, 75% of them have little or no social protection. Plus, you look at an informal environment that's creeping now into our new business models with platform business or internet mediated work, where there are no floors of income, minimum wages or minimum income, and indeed, of course, social protection. Then we need this new social contract. Now, the ILO declaration last year dealt with a lot of this, and it actually said that there must be a floor of rights and income under every worker, irrespective of the employment arrangements. When you think about that, and the fact that 97% of the supply chain workforce is a hidden workforce to in fact the CEOs who rely on those supply chains, then that's got to change. And I'll come to mandated due diligence, but that has to change. So when we think about what that floor of commitments, what is it? We say it's the ILO declaration says it's fundamental rights, the right to freedom of association, the right to organise and collectively bargain, the right to be free of discrimination. And of course, then it's occupational health and safety, which if COVID-19's shown us anything, it's a need to make it a fundamental right. And then in addition to that, we need an adequate minimum income, a minimum living wage on which people can live with dignity, evidence-based. We're talking about very low amounts of money. But if we don't put that floor with universal social protection in place, and that means everybody has a minimum income, you're not going to rebuild trust, even in our democracies. So when that's the case, we need that. And of course, control over working lives as telework explodes, as people are desperate, we must have some capacity to respect those age-old. The very first ILO convention was working time. While it may be, need to be revisited in the way we work, 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, and 8 hours relaxation, it's not the word, but I've lost the word at the moment, is actually what we need to respect in some boundaries, or less working time as we share jobs on the planet. So we talk about this as a new social contract, and in that new social contract, of which the ILO declaration would go a long way to achieving, we also need indeed a transformative agenda for women, because progress of women has stalled on every indicator, including participation in the labour market, and we need just transition for the shift in work and the shift in business from both climate action and technology. So there's a lot more there. But if we did that and reinvested in our public services to provide everybody those vital aspects of health and education and care, plus the fundamental social protection, we would put a floor of security and hope under people. So what's that got to do indeed with business? Well, jobs. Every sector has to transition or will not meet the net zero future that is the hope for averting the risk to human life. And if I've already told you about the loss of jobs, what if I told you that if we don't make this net zero challenges, then globally 1.2 billion jobs, or 40% of the total world employment, depend on a stable and healthy environment. And that even if you just take temperature increase, which is the least of it, then that will destroy 72 million full-time jobs by 2030 due to heat stress. So we're invested in protecting jobs as well as increasing and generating jobs. I've talked to you about rights, but let me put it in a business context, because environment and human and labour rights are entwined with jobs, climate-friendly jobs, and universal social protection. We talk about employment and climate-proofing our future, our workplaces and our future, and we cannot separate these issues. That's why we say just transition can only be built on these foundations. And due diligence must be mandated to ensure that the UN business and human rights principles are central to the business model. We are debating a UN treaty. We want business to get on board, as well as governments. We are looking at an EU commitment to mandated due diligence, and we say thank you, because that will put a floor, a different floor, under the business model for those who want to trade in and out of Europe. And we'd love to see the OECD guidelines, where the due diligence guidance has been agreed by governments and workers in an OECD context, as well as government-backed. We want to see it as a convention. We want governments and business to commit with us to building a very different future. It'll still have business in every sector we know, but every sector must transition, and every sector must indeed have a floor. And therefore, we want the WTO reform to see that human and labour rights and environmental standards are part of that. We need to be respectful of the global commons and the business model that we want. So, there's a growing movement around genocide. And indeed, we do have to debate whether environmental crime that we've inflicted on both the planet and on people is a global crime. But right now, we can actually make the difference that may or may not make that unnecessary. But SDGs cannot be realised without major reform of models of government, business and multilateralism. And I'd finish by saying to you that if we don't do this, then if we don't create that different model, if we don't actually have governments who put people at the heart and businesses who put people and the environment at the heart, then we are actually undermining the very trust in democracy. Less than 50% of people now live in democracies. And you know what's most shocking is that only less than 45% of our young people believe in democracy, when in the 80s and 90s, or 70s and 80s, it was actually 2/3 or more. So people, their rights in the environment are critical, but that means we've got to get beyond GDP. We have to do that and expand government accountability with business and labor and communities in support of what matters. Otherwise, we can't rebuild trust in our democracies, but we certainly can't build that future that we're all central to with a new economic model that does underpin climate and economic justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharan. That was all to show it was live and it was not pre-recorded, because I wasn't allowed to unmute myself for a little while. So apologies for the little pause there. That was super. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I think that last point about the fact that so many young people across the world have lost their faith in democracy. There was a very important study, I guess you were referring to, from the University of Cambridge just last month along those lines, from, I think from memory, about 160 different countries, and half young people saying they didn't think that they needed democracy. I thought that was a really, really worrying wake-up call for any of us who care about the future, and clearly the work that your International Trade Union Confederation are doing in relation to your Global Human Rights Index, monitoring the fact that the decline of democracy and the constraints on things like freedom of speech, and of course with that, the constraints on freedom of association is a massive threat. Sharan, I'd like to begin because in this country where I'm based right now in the UK, there is, I think, a false commentary that says the environmental agenda, oh, that's for kind of a metropolitan elite that is worried about those kinds of things and can afford to be, and so on, and that people who are working in the trade union movement and elsewhere, they're much more concerned with bread and butter issues. As I say, I think that's a false, completely false, and I think it's a rather arrogant analysis. And I think you very powerfully made the case about the interrelationship, but does your kind of polling evidence with your trade union members across the world show you that in fact there is that understanding that you can't do much business on a dead planet? There aren't many jobs to be had on a dead planet. Therefore, things are interrelated.
Well, you've captured our famous phrase that we actually use to fight for a just transition, which is there are no jobs on a dead planet. And now, of course, we have to fight to build jobs on a living planet. But, you know, our polling is really heartening. More than 2/3 of people absolutely demand climate action, and they see it as urgent. And I'm not going to lie to you, this is the most painful thing for the trade union movement. You know, when you walk the coalfields like I do and many other union officials, or you sit down and talk to workers in the fossil fuel industry, then they are, I mean, they're frightened because it is their communities, their livelihoods. And that's why we say no stranded people, no stranded communities. We can plan a different future. We can make that just transition, which will actually generate jobs as well as protect jobs. But we have to have businesses who want to do that. And right now, we have a fossil fuel industry that is except for a few notable players, doing anything but. Even as other businesses try to work on what does climate and employment look like in terms of due diligence, just transition, and the other demands, their commitment to the SDGs, and decent work, of course, is part of that, goal 8. But, you know, when you have those industries, again, on the one hand, fighting for existence is one thing, but these people own an enormous amount of global wealth. And if they can't reinvent themselves then they're going to disappear, and our jobs will disappear to the extent they can be protected. So yes, we'll fight for quality jobs in renewable energy, but I can tell you, if you look at the battle going on with gas right now, and the distortions of the gas as a transition technology debate, then because people want new gas, well, there are less jobs in new gas than there are in renewable energy. And while the battle for, you know, rights and decent work and just wages in renewable energy sectors is clear, nevertheless, young people want renewable energy because they're committed to climate, and they want job opportunities, and of course they want decent work. So, you know, we can't be on different sides of this equation, not if we're actually going to secure a planet for our children and grandchildren. And frankly, if you looked at those jobs figures, protect our own jobs. 40% of them dependent on a stable future, so the environmentally stable future. So this is just something we have to accept. It's one thing to accept the science. It's another thing to accept the responsibilities for climate and employment proofing our future.
Absolutely. Now, we are starting to get questions coming in on the Q&A panel, so thank you very much. Please do keep them coming. We'll try over the next 35 minutes or so to keep as many of those questions under review and try and cover them off as we possibly can. So you talked, Sharan, about the importance of governments, of businesses playing their part in the just transition, but obviously also it requires governments. And we have a question, actually anonymous, a question about, do you think that the election of Joe Biden as the next US president is going to help with the speed up of the just transition?
Well, my fingers are crossed, as you can see. I think it will shift. I mean, the first thing to say is the leaders in other countries that want to be part of building this future will have at least a partner they can talk to. That's a good thing. We hope to see the barriers that the Trump administration put in place for wind energy, for example, you know, done away with. We have Danish pension funds and Danish companies actually wanting to build wind energy platforms off the coast of New York. And of course, you have environmentally friendly and labor friendly governors and mayors in that environment, with the New York Labor Council and the AFL, who see the benefits of this, but it's been held up by restrictions. So if we can eliminate those, but if I can tell you, even in the US, which is most difficult, and it is most difficult, you have workers being frightened by companies who don't want to actually move on. You have a whole lot of fear there, but there are incredible pockets of union leadership, the AFL itself, but of course then the New York Labor Council, the Texas Labor Council, and many in between. You know, if a Texan leader of the Texas Labor Council can say, it's frightening, but we have to do it, then frankly, everything's possible. But governments have a key role. And of course, we've got two demands of governments. One is that they put just transition in their nationally defined contributions for the COP next year, and they should be ambitious, NDCs, because otherwise you won't provide business certainty or certainty for labour. And secondly, that they convene the social dialogue with business and unions to make this possible, to get the agreements you've seen around coal in Germany, in Spain, in Canada, in many places now. We need that not only to be about coal, we need it to be about all sectors. And then there's a role for business and unions. If you look at the example that was played out by my deputy president with the CEO of the Swedish steel industry or Swedish steel company, SAB, last week for the Race to Zero dialogues, then, you know, everybody said we can't transition heavy industry. Well, we can, and we must. And they're doing it together. And then in addition to that, we have these amazing mayors all around the world who are in fact committed to net zero. That will take unions and business and community to work out indeed how to build those living cities. And everybody has a role with jobs, with services, with social protection, but we have to figure out how to fund this recovery and indeed to invest in our cities as well as in jobs in other sectors. But the cities have a whole lot of hope. Why? Because if we can build those living cities, if we can transition, all the industries of today will be the industries of tomorrow. They'll just be using different technologies. If we can do that, then it actually builds the demand and supply curve in and out of the rural areas, whether it's in your country or whether it's through global trade internationally. And my final piece on this is funding the recovery. It must be tax, not austerity. There are global monopolies in our world. You know, if you look at the increased profits of just the tech sector to July of this year through the pandemic, 41% increase in tax. And yet if we don't put a digital tech tax in place, then you're never going to capture that. There are illicit trade flows out of the developing world. You know, a minimum business tax would assist with that. There's lots of work for us to do, but we'll only do it together. That's the message, David.
Thank you very much. Now, we've got a question from Giles Bristow. I guess looking at his email address, possibly from the Ashton Trust, he asked if you've got a 10-point action plan. You may have seen this morning that the British Prime Minister announcing a 10-point plan on transitioning to a low carbon economy. But do you have a 10-point action plan, or indeed some key additional points to what you've just been enumerating around the just transition?
We definitely do. And we have an action plan for a new social contract, which involves a just transition, but changes the floor of the business model that I described. And indeed builds into that the kind of commitments we want from governments. If you go back to that government accountability and transparency, then what do we want to see in headlines? Not GDP as the monitoring tool alone, but living standards, jobs, the advance on human and trade union rights, the advance on environmental standards, and indeed, of course, what governments are doing about just transition. And what we say to people is, I can give you our 10-point plan, happy to do it. But indeed, what I want to say to you is people have to build this together. So every June, we run an event that's actually about workers simply talking to their employers, called Climate and Employment Proofing Your Workplace. What's the plan? And then, of course, we also, work to see that every country now is building a jobs plan. And it has to be a jobs plan where they're not just jobs, but climate-friendly jobs and social protection with rights. So yeah, we have lots of plans and we want to see them implemented. One of the plans actually that I'd like your viewers to understand is that if you have 75% of the world's people with little or no social protection, then that base of resilience against future shocks doesn't exist, just doesn't exist. And we're going to see, you know, who knows, 500 million people thrown back into extreme poverty. And even then, it's a crap standard, you know, less than $2 a day seen as some sort of, you know, benchmark. That's just not possible to accept. So we want to see a global fund for social protection for the poorest countries. Why? Because it will help business. It'll include self-employed people who we organise and so do business, but it will also help all of those workers in the informal sector and build a resilience, but also a basic economy in each of those countries. The multiplier impact is stunning for just a few percentage points of GDP. And business and we can advocate to governments, one simple thing at this point, of the ODA that the rich nations, the overseas development aid, the rich nations give to poorer nations, then only 0.4% is spent on social protection. Even if we could get that up to 5%, then you would be giving people hope. If we can add debt relief, which the business community, the ICC, and we've been campaigning around debt relief and elimination of debt through debt workout mechanisms, if we can add those things to it, with if the US changes one thing, change their, well, not just one thing, but something on the international stage, commit to those special drawing rights, which with liquidity swaps, so richer countries can donate some of their increased liquidity to those countries. And we would say to the World Bank and the IMF, end your conditionality frame, except for one thing. You just demand of those countries that they actually commit to invest in the SDGs and their people and the environment. And we will see a very different set of, a basis of hope for those workers and their families, but also for businesses and for the planet.
Great, thank you. Now, I'm assuming from those climate and employment protection, your workplace dialogues in June each year, that will give you an answer to Karen Matthews' question, which is, can we have some specific examples of businesses that you think are at least on the way to supporting this kind of just transition that other businesses can look to and learn from?
Absolutely. I'll just name a couple, but there's a lot. For my, since then, because we believe very much in social dialogue, we don't always agree with business, obviously, but we believe in the dialogue and advancing, common agreement. And so I'm a member of the B team of business and key civil society leaders. People like Mary Robinson and I and others join the B team leaders, committed to net zero, to human rights, and indeed to anti-corruption or, good business models, including fair taxation. And so when you go beyond them and say, where are some of those businesses stacking up? Well, there's a lot of them, but Unilever, for example, works with our IUF and ITF, industrial global unions, transport and agriculture, to actually look at how they don't just commit to mandated due diligence, but how they do it with unions as partners. How do they identify the risks and the violations? How do they put in place the grievance procedures for remedy and then monitor healthy supply chains? Now, they're not perfect, and they'll tell you that, but we're on a journey. The same with Danone. Danone shifted its French operation from being, a shareholder primacy model to what they call mission d'entreprise, but it's actually about a much broader. I don't like the stakeholder model definition, particularly because I read last week, my greatest fear is that, yes, all this is good, provided it doesn't affect the share price. Well, guess what? We are all going to have to share prosperity. I always say, why do you want to make money if you're not prepared to share it? Because that's the basis of inclusive growth. And if you're not prepared to do that, we're all in trouble. And of course, we have $45 trillion worth of, or just over 40, I should say, $1 trillion of pension funds invest in the global economy. So we want them to shift on the investment demand spectrum to this model of new social contract, which is climate and jobs and human rights. But if you look at Danone, and again, I sit on not on the governance structure, I would never do that, but in fact on their, if you like, their oversight committee with a whole lot of other fascinating people that are actually, Emmanuel Faber is such an open CEO with great ambitions that he wants to know where they're not getting it right. They're setting ambitious targets for their products. Again, not perfect. And, it's fascinating to engage in that discussion, and for their workers. And in fact, he just gave a commitment. In fact, those two companies, let me tell you about the jobs commitment. Alan Jupe, in a jobs summit with me last week, actually said they're committed to a net zero jobs loss. That's extraordinary. Now, they're big enough to make that possible, although it will be difficult. Emmanuel Faber has committed to not sack any worker or make them redundant under a certain level of income, working with the International Union of Food Workers, and to retrain them so they have a skills base and can be deployed in other parts of the company. This is the basis of us working together to figure out how we actually look after people as well as the planet through the business model. And there are many more.
I think this is super. I would, wouldn't I, as a professor of corporate responsibility, and I think the examples you've quoted are both excellent ones.
Mind you, David, let me burst that bubble.
Yep.
Sorry, just let me burst that bubble. There is also the reality that more than 70% of companies have no commitment to human rights. I just want to put that on the table. So these are the companies trying to change the world with us, and they won't be perfect, but between us, we're going to get somewhere if we can.
And absolutely right. I always say these are the leaders. The trouble is that we've still got a very, very long laggard's tail, or even people not even getting on the journey at all. Do you ever get any flack from your members saying, you're our boss as the president of the International Trade Union Confederation? You shouldn't be swanking around with Paul Pullman and Alan Jope and Emmanuel Faber and so on. You should be marching against them and everything. I mean, I don't think you should, by the way, but do you ever get any flack like that?
Well, what do you think? Of course. In fact, if anyone looked at my Twitter feed right now, they're actually attacking, other players, I think, besides me. But, there's no trust. I'm incredibly fortunate. I have the most privileged job in the world. I can go to any workplace in any country, work with the unions in those countries, although not right now in this virtual world, which I kind of don't love personally. But nevertheless, there's anger and despair. So of course I do. But our global leaders, I'm very, very privileged to have the most courageous group of union leaders. If you look at what unions did immediately COVID-19 hit, they went to campaign, to negotiate, to agree on the advances on the social contract, in access to health, in jobs protection and wage protection, which meant investing in continuity of business, and of course in income protection for those who fall outside the MIS, and an increase in public services and in those income fundamentals around social protection where they could. Now the struggle is to keep some of that and now see jobs plans and a greater universal social protection. And this is not limited to developing countries. All our unions were magnificent, but is there a fear of the future from working people? Absolutely. And why wouldn't there be? If this business model keeps going, then frankly, capitalism is at risk. Now, I'm not, a huge fan of capitalism or any other economic order. I'm actually very committed to cooperatives and a whole range of the way in which we mold our communities and our economic and social lives. But it is the model we live with. So if that's the dominant model, then the role of a trade union leader is to see that people get a fair share. And that can only be based on rights. It can only be based on, a fair and just income through both minimum wages and collective bargaining, and on a share of our tax base for public services, for the infrastructure that generates jobs, and of course for, the social protection that we all need.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm happy to be. I describe myself to these business leaders as late as last week as I'm a troublesome friend, and I am a troublesome friend. Ask the government of Qatar. I fought against the kafala system, a system of modern slavery in Qatar and in the Gulf states. That fight continues, although we hope to see improvements in Saudi Arabia, despite the troublesome base of some of rights in that country. But, there's work going on. But for 5 years, with Amnesty, with Human Rights Watch, we exposed the disasters. Now we have the end of kafala in Qatar. We have the systems in place that, we'll still have disputes. That's normal. But we now have the recipe for resolving them. And that's the role of trade unions. We'll fight when there's oppression, But when we have a capacity to get the agreement, to get the social dialogue and the bargaining that makes it possible to shift the base of that oppression, then that's our responsibility. So troublesome friend if you're not doing the right thing, good friend if you are.
Excellent, excellent. I think that's right. Now listen, one of the real great strengths of the crowd is that it's a very eclectic network of people. That's why it's the crowd. And so it's not just people from big companies and so on, it's NGOs and so on, but also lots of startup entrepreneurs and so on who want to model their own businesses in ways which are economically and environmentally and socially just and so on. So we've got Chris Friedler. I don't know if he is a startup entrepreneur himself, but I suspect maybe from the question he might be. He asks, so how can startup companies, particularly in new industries such as hydrogen and carbon sequestration and capture, best engage with unions as they start to grow their employee numbers? And it seems to me that if we really want to get the next generation of more kind of purposeful entrepreneurs and so on, that's a great question to be able to have a go at.
No, but that's the best question because, you know, we actually jointly organize not the very wealthy startups, of course, but, you know, self-employment as well as business around the world. In fact, we are often better placed. On a different level, if I can tell you one of the proudest moments, it was to see a tiny union in Mali actually get the right for mechanics, we would call them, they call themselves garages, to operate out of their homes, in their front yards, to build those businesses vital to the community, but in fact were illegal before they were organized and action. And there's many more stories like that. You know, our Self-Employed Women's Association in India builds cooperatives, and where they don't have the services, whether it's childcare or financial services or health service, you should see what they did for each other, with each other in their communities during the threat of COVID-19, are still doing. And at the same time, fighting for jobs guarantees and minimum income and so on. But on the wealthiest startup businesses, it's a very simple recipe. Start by actually sharing your ambitions and working with your employees. Respect their rights, and we can help with that. Respect their ambitions to share in the prosperity with just wages, and look to occupational health and safety to see people are safe. Where you want to work with their unions, then just ask. Ask me if you don't know who to work with. We will find you a partner to actually build, you know, a sustainable and a just business model, which does respect both rights and environments.
Great. I mean, as you may see, just on the screen behind me, I have the privilege of chairing something called the Institute of Business Ethics. And one of the things that we try and encourage organizations of any size to do is to sit down and think about, so how do we want people to judge our organization? How do we want people in this organization to behave? How do we want to treat our customers, our suppliers, and so on, our neighbors in industrial estates or the office blocks where we're based, and so on and so forth? And that's the basis for what's our kind of code of business principles, or our code of ethics, and the way that we want to do business. And then thinking through, having got that, ideally with people from across the business, to pick up Chris's point, then how do we then think about, how do we manage people ethically? How do we engage people in our workforce ethically along those lines? Now, we've got two questions which I think we can combine. One's from this very ubiquitous anonymous, who asks about the role that workers themselves have to play in upskilling, retraining for the new, more environmentally friendly jobs and so on. And Oliver Davis, who says, look, universities can play an important role in the retraining of workers for employment in sustainable industries, but where's the funding going to come from that? So I think two linked questions about everyone, I think, would accept there has to be a lot of reskilling. Think about all of those workers in the American Rust Belt and so on, who President Trump so disgracefully made false promises to back in 2016 and hasn't obviously delivered on, but how do you help people to make the decision they want to reskill, and then how do you fund all of that?
Well, you know, skilling is not a new subject, and it is critical. You know, I started life as a teacher, so education and skills are fundamental. Before I left my previous role in late 2010, I sat on the Australian Skills Council, and business workers through their unions and government saw this as a collective responsibility. And when I hear people now talking about, you know, lifelong learning, it's really critical. But, you know, it's been a concept and an ambition for many business and union leaders for 30 years. And so we just have to have the will to implement. Now, of course, it will cost workers in time and commitment. But if governments and employers aren't committed to a skills base for the future, if they're not committed to funding education, by the way, as we create those jobs, can I tell you, there's about 80 million jobs gap now in education, in schools around the world. And that's without looking at other things. And I totally agree with you about universities. You know, universities, technical colleges, all of these people are the backbone of education and skilling. But you have to have the commitment at the core. The German system, for example, there are many others around the world, the German system, where it's simply a part of life, that, you know, apprenticeship training and so on is managed by the social partners. That's the model we have to see. You know, in America, the AFL unions provide the apprenticeship base because unions are desperately committed to skilling. And we need to do a lot more of it. But one thing I want to warn people of, when you have a look at the base of employment to date, skills is a luxury we can solve the problem of. I mean that seriously, because it's this much of the population that actually is in a position to be upskilled right now. Now, it is critically part of just transition, but when you look at the explosion of digital work, and we're all trying to deal with that. You know, we've got new legislation in Spain, in Argentina. It's really important that we don't make those jobs, again, part of a, you know, race back to the last century around rights and conditions and income. But at the same time, 40% of the world's people are not yet connected to the internet. You know, I hear the vision of a very critical sector in agriculture that just, you know, again, I'm not opposed to those companies changing their models of behavior and particularly their rights and environmental commitments in the agribusiness areas. But that's not a future for everybody. Big agriculture is not a future. It may have a relationship with a whole lot of people, but the counter movement to people saying this is our land, this is our culture, we want, you know, minimum basic incomes. We want health and safety. We want to know that, in fact, we can service the local market. And there's that growing demand in the environmental sense for local products. So food security, you know, our food system's broken. And for, you know, and it's my privilege to be a food and land use ambassador, even though this is not my area of expertise, but I think it's so important that the scientists and the farmers and those agricultural experts who work together. So all I say to you is it's not always about big business, but of course those big businesses who rely so much on small to medium enterprises have to play their role in working with us and governments to reshape the economic model that is respectful. So when you're talking about startups, again, you know, startups, small business, micro enterprises, critical also for women. But indeed, we must make sure that we are supportive, but that we do that within a respectful frame of human and labour rights and environmental standards.
And that brings me on to perfectly to another question, which says, how do you think that people who are at more middle to senior management level can support their more junior colleagues, perhaps also frontline workers in their suppliers, to put pressure on executive teams to be able to implement a faster sustainable business transition. So
it's called social dialogue and collective bargaining. You know, these are age-old, you know, coming out of 2 world wars and a Great Depression. The ILO was born in 1919 with the ambition of putting a social floor in place. But because people understood then that in fact the world, the social unrest was simply growing. And as a result, conflict, wars were potentially the future. Well, they were. Another world war, a Great Depression. But read the Philadelphia Declaration of 1944. Not written on high by, you know, kind of one great leader, although it was drafted by a few, but it was agreed by those very early pioneers in business, in labour, and indeed, well, in fact, at the beginning, labour and government were the architects. But we wanted business at the table because the role was vital. If they're going to employ workers and they have to take responsibility, it's no different today. And in some ways, we're relitigating, you know, building new campaigns because we're not keeping up with those foundations of a global floor of rights and the rule of law and compliance with, in fact, what the business model needs to be.
Now we're almost coming to the end of our time, so I'd like to try and squeeze, if we can, a couple more questions in. There's a crucial one just come in from Natalie Grant, which is, I suppose, the real elephant in the room. The recovery packages need to be funded. That, you said, quite, in my view, quite rightly, has to be based on taxes, not more austerity on those who can least afford it. So how would you, from a International Trade Union Confederation perspective, how would you ensure that the taxes are levied equitably, asks Natalie Grant.
So this is indeed the elephant in the room. It's the heart of the battle in the EU right now, and it will be everywhere. How do you fund the recovery? You know, we've got an $11 trillion spend to date, and it'll probably be, I don't know, 20 trillion or more by the time we see the hope of a recovery. We're blessed to have a low interest rate or no interest rate regime. And indeed, even though Kristalina Georgieva, head of the IMF herself, says that in this environment, the developed world can carry 100%, 125% of GDP as debt, we say yes, if in fact the fiscal consolidation that has to come at some point is leveraged off a medium to long-term management of debt, just as medium to long-term investment. So in summary, the EU position is mostly where we would want to be as trade unions. The recovery plans are committed on the basis of indeed the social pillar of rights. They're on the Green Deal, that transition and just transition. So those three pillars actually underpin the commitment of the EU Commission to recovery. And now we have to say, how do you finance it? Well, there are, from the UN through, we've been part of discussions around sustainable financing or financing the recovery. If you just look at the tax possibilities, it's so unfair on businesses who pay their tax that there's not a minimum floor of tax on every business. That's the first thing. That's up for discussion. The second thing is we've talked forever about a financial transaction tax. And if you look at the terrible outcomes of the last financial crisis, where we supported an investment of taxpayers' money, 2%, looks like such a small amount now. But in fact, it was the speculators and the creditors who called in that debt straight away. And then austerity was born, which people paid 3 times for the funding of the last recovery, through their taxpayer dollars, through indeed the loss of jobs, and then for the attack on their wages and social protection. That can't happen again. And speculation is greater now, David, than it was then. So that financial transaction tax is still on the books.
A Tobin tax.
Yeah, well, in some form, it's still on the books. And then you have the new digital tax. I've already indicated how we need to, to share that prosperity. And of course, we would say break up those big tech companies because they're not fair competition for the rest of business. And we've got that campaign going on right now. And then the final one is indeed a billionaires or a wealth tax. Oxfam have been out in front with this, but we've got more billionaires that we've ever had in our history. You can't spend all that money. Jeff Bezos can't spend his money in a lifetime. We have to have some sort of wealth tax that doesn't impact on people, who are, struggling to make a living, or those who are in the building the middle classes. But for a billionaire, come on, we can do better than this. So I simply finish by saying, if our workers help to build prosperity and profit in the world, then why doesn't business want to share it?
Sharan, it's been a genuine pleasure and an enormous privilege to have this conversation with you today. I've learned a lot of things. I've been scribbling notes to go away and check. We've answered quite a number of the questions we had. Apologies to Gabrielle and to others that we weren't able to get to, but I do now have to thank you enormously and hand back to Tiffany just to do the wrap up. So, Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you both so much. That was really, really insightful. I'm sure everyone who joined us today would agree, and I too was scribbling notes that I'll be going and reading back later. So thank you both. Thank you also to everyone who joined us today, whether that's here on Zoom or over YouTube or other social media channels. As I mentioned earlier in the intro, so our Green Recovery Festival, it's running for 2 weeks until the 26th of November. We have lots of other events coming up, lots of Q&A talks, panel discussions, and interactive sessions as well. If anyone's interested in finding out what we're up to beyond the festival, so what we have planned for 2021 and our own activities around COP26, then feel free to get in touch with myself or my colleagues at the Crowd. And yeah, just one final thank you to you all, to our speakers today, and to everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.